So now that Games Workshop have finished turning 40k upside down for a week in the balance update, let's talk about what sort of list people are running with one strong army list for every single army in the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking 40k army lists, and given that Games Workshop's made quite such a monumental update to 40k by a vast amount of points changes, plus some rules buffs and nerfs, I thought that it would be quite good fun to take a look at the tournaments that have been running over the past couple of weeks and single out one strong army list for every single faction, something that's done quite well in events, and let us see what one player is running for each faction to at least some degree of good success. So far in 40k we've only had around about 1.5 weeks worth of tournament data with the new points and rules updates, but just in general 40k balance seems to be looking a massive amount better. Previously it was the Eldar stomping greater than 50% of tournaments, and then only a very select group of armies managing to take down events or place high. In the few spots that Aeldari didn't take, the upheaval seems to have absolutely flipped this on its head though. Seems like the meta in Warhammer 40k is going to be very diverse for a bit, maybe in a good period of experimentation before people fixate on the new things that seem to be overall the most reliable. In general though, things look massively better than they were before. Way more armies getting a look in, and for this video it wasn't even too hard to find one example of each army doing well. I managed to find a list that had at least 4 wins and 1 loss for all armies bar 2 of them, and even those 2 had very good placings at team tournaments as well, still giving us an insight into a strong competitive list. In this video we're just going to take a look at one example from each army, one army that's done well, ideally placing 4 wins or higher at a grand tournament. Generally that tends to be at least fairly selective for both a good player and a strong army list that they're using. Definitely possible that not all of these are going to be 100% optimised yet. People haven't had all that much chance to either theory craft or to acquire any new models they might want, so I'm sure things will develop a fair bit for a number of factions beyond here. Still though, gives us some good insights as to what people are running. Let's talk through each army and roughly what choices they've made and what looks interesting for each faction, and of course feel free to let me know any insights as to how certain armies were played, or if I do make any errors for the army list in question. Jumping straight in then, and we'll start with Imperium and go through Core Codex Space Marines, doing the more divergent chapters a little bit later in the Imperium section. I'm not going to go through every single chapter, given that they basically function more or less the same from a core mechanics point of view, though with the Codex and the different playstyles that should bring with detachments, that should give us a really big shake-up. For an example of an Ultramarines winning list, here's one by Morgan Smerick, who used it to take first at Fields of Damnation, going 5-0 against 54 players. And the list is a Gladius task force that's fairly infantry focused, just a couple of vehicles, but really quite a lot of squads being run on the board. Leading the list are 4 leaders. There's Marnius Calgar, who dropped quite nicely in points with his Honour Guards. He's quite a good melee powerhouse and generates command points, plus allows you to advance and charge. An Apothecary Biologist with Bolter Discipline, who I'm sure is going with the aggressors. They can put out some seriously fearsome firepower with Bolter Discipline, particularly with some stratagem support. There's a Primaris Chaplain with the Artificer Armour. He could go either with the Blade Guard or maybe the Assault Intercessors, plus 1 to wound in melee would work well for either of those, and Uriel Ventress, the unique Ultramarines captain who allows one of the squads to deep strike. I kind of wonder if that might be the aggressors that are planning to do that. I suppose if he planned to use Rapid Ingress or something though, then quite a lot of them could have been quite good targets, delivering the units into melee. The squads that they can support are the aggressors, Blade Guard, and Assault Intercessors. The Assault Intercessors take a Power Fist. I'd guess that Marnius is most likely to go either with the aggressors or the Blade Guard, maybe one of the units being delivered by Uriel Ventress's Deep Strike, and perhaps one by the Lamb Raider. I guess that could be a reasonable choice for transporting the Blade Guard unit, perhaps, and getting them into melee. Lamb Raiders do seem to be really quite common in Space Marine competitive lists following the points update. Looks like they've finally broken through to a points cost where people actually are pretty excited to take them. Otherwise, there's a chunky unit of durable heavy intercessors with their new even lower points cost, 5 regular intercessors taking a Thunderhammer and grenade launcher, 3 eliminators with their last fusils, and an instigator bolt carbine for move shoot move. They're just enormously efficient at 75 points now. 3 inceptors for the close deep strike, plus some plasma exterminators to take down some elites, and 5 incursors for the +1 to hit on 1 target. This does seem a bit of a flip around from Space Marine lists that have been going around quite a bit. A lot of armies have just been running an enormous amount of tanks. Nice to see some infantry and particularly some intercessors breaking through. They hadn't been very common in competitive lists at all. Finally, there's a Redemptor Dreadnought with dual Gatling cannons. He feels like a particularly nice one to fire into the Oath of Moment targets. He should do around about 5-ish devastating wounds to the target, never mind his other guns, if you are fishing for maximal rerolls at least. Overall seems pretty cool. I do like the unit diversity, there's no spam here, and pretty good to see some people doing well with the new cheaper intercessors. Next up, there's a Raven Guard list that I talked about the other week on the channel. This one by Florian Schmidt, who used it to take 4th at Munsterland GT, going 4-1 against 33 players and only losing to the overall event winner. I did talk about this a bit last week, so I maybe won't go into it as much detail, but in general the list just feels really quite technical with a whole load of tools to control the game. Loads of lone operatives with Kayvon Shrike leading around a big unit of assault marines, a very scary unit considering that you can't shoot them, some sniper scouts that can't be shot unless you're close, and a librarian and phobos armor giving lone operative type protection to a unit of infiltrators for one super safe objective. Otherwise there's some sniper eliminators with move shoot move, 3 sets of 3 eradicators with multi-melters for some dedicated anti-tank, and then again another land raider, a big one for aggressors with bolt storm and frag storm, an apothecary biologist with bolter discipline once more, and this time a captain with gravis armor to allow them some free stratagems and extra melee muscle. Finally, again, there's a double Gatling cannon Redemptor for firing at Oath of Moment things, a Thunderfire cannon to slow down a key enemy unit, and 1 Calidus Assassin to jump on and off the board doing secondaries. Again, more lone operative goodness there, and also has that nasty power that she could use to ruin an enemy command point reroll. Overall, a very cool list. All the lone operative units feel like this could be a real challenge to deal with gunline units in particular. Next up, seems that someone's managed to win a small grand tournament with Astra Militarum. This list by Michael Costello took first at Partisan Games, and does seem to be making good use of some cheaper infantry and tanks. For the command point shenanigans, there's the classic pairing of Lord Solar Leontus for CP and big orders, plus Ursula Creed for her free stratagem. Definitely a lot more limited than it was, but I believe it's the Fields of Fire one that still remains very nice. There's then a platoon command squad with all the regimental attaches, so you could have some fairly coordinated artillery. And also technically a character is the tank commander. He takes a demolisher, heavy stubber, multi-melters and las cannon, and he also has the grand strategist enhancement as well. That's the one that allows you to do an additional order, and I feel like for 220 points that's kind of worth the extra 20 points over a demolisher, allowing you to order 2 different tanks. I guess between him and Mr. Leontus they'd be supporting the armoured units. Perhaps chief amongst them are 2 of the cheaper Rogue Dawns at 260 points now, a presser cannon, melter sponsons, 3 stubbers, and 1 takes the pulverizer, 1 a castigator. Just generally pretty tough and pretty dangerous. 1 Lehman Ross exterminator, which is the autocannon one which can mark a target for extra AP. And there is still some artillery on the table, both a basilisk and a manticore for some sturdy indirect firepower, and the basilisk can also slow a unit. For the infantry side of things, there's a great big Cadian shock troop squad with 2 grenade launchers and 2 plasma guns. I guess that'll be where the platoon command squad will be attaching, and then I'd guess either Leontus or Ursula Creed. I suppose the other one of those 2 might attach to the Kazakin, 2 plasma and 2 melter in that one, unless they're doing something fun like going for strategic reserve or something like that. Kind of interesting as to how they were used given that there's no transports for them. Then there's 3 heavy weapon teams with mortars, a unit of 5 rattlings for some forward deploy and some move shoot move, and then a single unit of Tempestus Scions which could be handy for dropping in for secondaries or just dealing a little bit of close range fire support with a plasma gun and a hot shot volley gun. Finally, there's 2 other Scout Sentinels that are still just very cheap and efficient. They take missile launchers and a Hunter Killer missile and chainsaw. Even at 60 points I still think that they're pretty standout good with their scout move and their sheer durability. Overall, really quite cool to see an interpretation of the new guard. Really nice to see some versions of the army that are pivoting a lot more towards tanks and infantry as opposed to artillery spam that we had in early 10th. Next up for the Sisters of Battle, we have a very armour heavy list by Sean Bear, who used this list to take 4th at War for the Forge GT, going 4 wins to 1 loss against a field of 30 players. This list, like quite a few Sisters lists in the past, has gone very light on any sort of elite infantry that was often their mainstay in 9th edition. It seems to be mainly hero, hammer, plus a bunch of armour. For the characters, there's the Triumph of St. Catherine, who I think seems borderline auto-include at 125 points, just a big annoying thing to have in the centre of the board, and perhaps decently tough for its cost at 125 points. St. Celestine and Morven Var both make an appearance, Morven Var leading a unit of Paragon suits with War Maces and Multi-Melters for the big rerolls with them. Still maybe a bit fragile, but they do hit very hard with Morven's rerolls. Celestine would run with the Seraphim, I guess, quite a nice unit with some hand flamers and some serious melee power, and then Ephrael Stern and Kaiganil give you some lone operative goodness. And then there's a Dialogus with Saintly Example, A very cheap character to give up somewhere between 2 and 4 miracle dice when she's killed. I suppose could either go with the Battle Sisters or literally just try and get herself martyred somewhere. If she's going with the Battle Sisters and their multi-melter, I guess that means that she could turn a wound roll into an automatic 6 or potentially a damage roll, I guess. Otherwise, then there's a Sister's Motor Pool, an Immolator with a multi-melter, which I guess could be used to split the Battle Sister unit in two. That would be quite nice to get 2 small units of them. Maybe you could have one transported forward with the melter gun and multi-melter, and the cheap one to camp home field objectives. There's 3 Castigator tanks with the battle cannons, fairly strong fire support against a whole bunch of targets, but the AP-1 could be a bit of a letdown against some. 2 Exorcists for some fairly threatening ignores line of sight firepower, and then 3 Mortifiers, each with heavy bolters and the choice of either a flail or buzzblade when they're attacking combat. Finally again there's a Calidus Assassin, jumping on and off the board, doing secondaries, and messing with enemy stratagems. Overall, I guess it's nice to see Sisters still having some success, despite largely being a bit lamented with their update in the balanced data slate. Hopefully Games Workshop eventually gets them to a point, though, where it doesn't make sense for people just to go all in on the armour. Next up for the Grey Knights, here's a list by Boyd Morale, using it to take second at RatCon, going 5-0 against a field of 90 players, though I understand that this tournament did use some custom missions, which might skew things a bit, I suppose. Still though, very cool to see some success with Grey Knights. I feel like the points changes were kind of interesting for them, given that they were an army that just really was struggling to deal with the raw stats of certain armies, just not doing enough damage to tough vehicles, but then did get some fairly meaningful points cuts, and they do have their absolutely godly teleport shenanigans to jump around the board scoring things and stay safe when needed. The list builds around 3 units of Terminators, 2 units of 5 Brotherhood Terminators with an Apothecary and an Ancient in them, plus a Psy Cannon, and then 1 big block of 10 Paladins. They went down in points quite significantly. Looks like each of those units gets a Brotherhood Librarian in it, just for some nasty mortal wound damage with Vortex of Doom. And there's also a Brotherhood Chaplain for the extra damage boost in close combat, and he also has the Sigil of Exigence, the one that allows you to teleport away when you're targeted. I guess that's one more Terminator character than they have squads to join, so I suppose one of them's running solo. Not sure if it's a Librarian or that Chaplain who at least has the Sigil to protect him. Otherwise, seems like the Dread Knights seem to be finally back. They did get some pretty massive points cuts. There's a Grandmaster version here with the Demon Hammer. He's really quite nice against tanks with his big rerolls once per game. And he has a Psy Cannon, Incinerator, and Inescapable Wrath. That's the one for a +1 to charge rolls. There's then 2 more Nemesis Dread Knights that can move quite quickly across the board with their advance and damage. They take Incinerators, Psy Cannons, and Great Swords, and there's 1 unit of Strike Marines as well, I guess potentially to hold down a home objective. Overall, nice to see Grey Knights do well. I feel like they are going to be an army that in the hands of a good player is going to be pretty terrifying. The teleport shenanigans and mists of Daimos jumping all over the board is pretty scary, though they still might be an army that's struggling for raw damage somewhat. Next up we've got the Adeptus Mechanicus, and this is a list by Eric Nieder, who used it to take 5th at the War for the Forge duty, having 4 wins and 1 loss. Again, AdMech are an army that people weren't enormously hopeful about following the data slates, but at least it seems that someone's having a good time with them. I feel like compared with AdMech lists before, this one definitely goes a lot heavier on the Skirtari Vanguard, given that they got tougher and went down in points so much. Plus there's definitely more Sindonian Dragoons about as well. The list is headed up by 3 Tech Priest Manipuluses. One takes everyone's favourite dreaded Omni Sterilizer with the Transonic Cannon for the auto hits and Scary Overwatch. The other 2 take Excoriating Emanation and Master Annihilator with the Magnarail Lancers. I'd guess that both of those are probably going to be joining the big Cataphren squads to make their shooting better, or to make them harder to kill. There's also a Techno-Archaeologist as well, probably joining one of the Vanguard units. Talking of which, there are 40 Vanguard here. They all take the standard special weapons and upgrades they get for free. Not too bad general purpose units now, I think, with the durability increase, plus the points going down significantly. I guess a couple of those units are probably going to be riding in the Scorpius Dune Riders to take them into the mid-board and score some points. The 2 big blocks of Cataphrons remain some of the more efficient damage dealers in the index. 2 units of 6 Cataphron Breachers with arc rifles and hydraulic claws. Fairly good damage and defense there, and particularly against vehicles. There's 3 small interference units, 1 of 5 Skystalkers that could jump around doing secondaries, 1 unit of 3 Cerberus Sulphur Hounds, which could do quite well to bully lighter infantry nearby, and 1 unit of 5 Infiltrators starting in the midfield with Flechette and Tasers. Then beyond that, the rest of the list is all Chicken Walkers, 3 units of Sindonian Dragoons, which perhaps seem to be one of the bigger winners out of the AdMech data slate. Going down to 60 points does make them some pretty serious countercharge threat. and then 2 of the trusty Iron Striders with las cannons, fairly fast and tough, and a little bit of a sting in the tail to threaten tanks. Overall seems like really quite a nicely balanced list. It took 1 loss on round 2, and that was to Adepta Sororitas. Next up, for the Adeptus Custodes, they don't seem to have been having quite such a good time of it in singles events over the past week or so. I did notice this list though that did pretty well at a team tournament called the Grand Fanatic, run by a Matthias Lingard, who used it to take 4 wins and 1 draw. Just from the first look of it, it does look like quite a good example of what Custodes can run competitively after the Dataslate. They certainly feel like an army that might have to be thought about a fair bit more though, and can't just beat down most opponents with their raw stats alone. Leading up the list, there's a Blade Champion for the big threat range for Custodes on foot, and Trajan Valoris, I'd guess probably joining 2 of the units of Custodian Guard. There's 3 units of them, either 4 or 5 in strength, 2 shields, and 2 or 3 spears. The points drop for the Sagittarium seems to have been enough to justify their inclusion. There's 5 of them for 225 points with their heavy bolter type equivalents, 2 units of 2 Alarus Custodians with their teleporting and big damage against heavies. They take some axes. 1 cheap unit of Sisters of Silence, always handy to have for some objective scoring or secondaries. A Calidus Assassin that can again jump round the board and just be generally handy. And finally, I'm definitely unsurprised to see a couple of Caladius tanks here with the Arachnus Heavy Blaze Cannon. Certainly one of the more competitive Custodes units before, and they didn't get any points nerfs. It does seem that at least a fair few people are a bunch less excited to play Custodes at tournaments though. They have taken quite a battering from the nerfs. I feel like they haven't been toned down so much that they're entirely out of the running, though I guess we'll see. Another army that took an enormous battering from the balanced data slate were the Imperial Knights, though this list run by Joshua Megchel seems to do quite well at the Lakes of Blood, going 4 wins to 1 loss, and I believe either finishing 2nd or 3rd overall. I can't seem to make best coast pairings give up the secrets for that one. I'd say the army list is perhaps surprisingly similar to what Imperial Knights were running before, a pairing of a Crusader and Warden, even though their bondsman abilities have been nerfed quite a bit, no longer affecting themselves. The Crusader takes a Battle Cannon, Gatling Cannon, and Storm Spear pod, and he's got Mysterious Guardian. That's the one that allows it to basically do a single redeploy once per game, which could be seriously quite big for gaining a critical line of sight on something that your opponent doesn't want it to. The Warden still puts out plenty of firepower with the new style Devastating Wounds. That one takes Revered Knights for extra leadership for nearby bondsmen. Don't know if that was the only one that could be afforded. I wouldn't say it's one of my favourites, though I suppose it could make damaged knights a bit more reliable on objectives. Then there's 4 Armiger Warglaves with Stubbers, 150 points now, but still pretty fearsome with the built-in rerolls and those thermal spears. 2 Armiger Helverins, could be run alongside the Crusader for a +1 to hit maybe. I guess that the -1 damage from the Warden would go on one of the Warglaves, still a very nice unit to throw into the mid-board and have take damage. Finally, there's the trusty Calidus Assassin that seems to be running just about every second Imperial list at the moment, jumping on and off the board to do secondaries, ruin a stratagem, and maybe even kill a character if the opportunity arises. Finally, for the Imperium, let's take a look through the Divergent Space Marine chapters, and first up we've got a Dark Angels list that took War in the Forge by a Larry Paladin. Definitely a very unusual Dark Angels army list, built around 2 Land Raiders full of Terminators, an Impulsor full of Eliminators, and then 2 Predator tanks and 2 Dreadnoughts. For the Terminators, there's a squad of Deathwing Knights and a Deathwing Command Squad, one of which takes a Plasma Cannon. Both of those are pretty nice. Deathwing Knights just all around strong, and the Deathwing Command Squad do have good things going on with their extra objective control and also the healing a model each turn. One will get led by a Terminator Chaplain with his +1 to wound and defense against mortals, and one by a Terminator Captain with the Honor Vehement. That's the close combat boosting one. I'd guess that the Eliminators with their Las Fusils and Instigator Bolt Carbines might be using that rule which Games Workshop has had as a bit of an oversight, where they can technically disembark, shoot, and then re-embark using the Instigator Bolt Carbine, and then the Impulsor can go on to allow them to fire out of it due to it not having shot this turn. Games Workshop probably should patch that at some point. I don't actually know if that was how it was played though. Could just have been firing the Eliminators from the top hatch of the Impulsor with its shield dome. Next up, there's one of the new Ballistas Dreadnoughts at 150 points, a Redemptor Dreadnought, a Predator Destructor, and a Predator Annihilator. I'd maybe argue that a few of the choices are a little bit suboptimal there, but realistically not by much, and it certainly seems to have had good effect here. In any case, pretty cool to see quite such a different Dark Angels list do well. I guess all of that armour is probably going to stat check some armies as to whether they brought enough anti-tank. Next up for the Blood Angels, like the Custodes, these were an army that I struggled to find a singles army list that did well over the past couple of weeks. Looking into team tournaments though, this list by Sam Procopio did rather well. He used it to win 5 out of 5 at a team event called Studs and Snotlings. I do feel like just about whenever I go delving into army lists looking for Blood Angels, this guy's name comes up. In any case, this list uses one big block of Sanguinary Guard, presumably led by that jump captain with Thunderhammer and Storm Shield. The Sanguinary Guard unit has a bunch of Inferno pistols plus a banner, and I guess you could use the captain's ability for either Armor of Contempt for durability, or maybe the +1 to wound with Lance when you're charging. For the other big Blood Angels unit, there's Lamarti's leading a unit of 10 Death Company, which went down really quite significantly. I feel like the Inferno Pistol and Power Fist loadout of them with the jump packs looks utterly terrifying. They really are very cheap for just how much carnage they can unleash. Then beyond that, despite the new higher price tag, there's 2 big units of 10 Stern Guard here, each with the Stern Guard heavy bolters. I guess big units would be pretty handy if they do manage to trigger their shooting twice special rule. If you did manage to trigger their ability by slaying one enemy unit, then that's a whole load of extra shots there. And they do particularly well in combination with Oath of Moment as well. Getting full rerolls to wound with devastating wounds is going to chip some scary damage off anything, particularly now the saves that work against mortal wounds no longer work against them. Otherwise, a unit of 3 Inceptors with the Close Deep Strike and Assault Bolters, 2 units of 5 Sniper Scouts with the Can't Be Targeted greater than 12 inches, very nice just to park on objectives, 5 Infiltrators with their forward deployment and Deep Strike denial shenanigans, a single attack bike with a multi-melter, and then a Librarian Dreadnought and a Whirlwind on the vehicle side of things. I'm going to guess that the Librarian Dreadnought is going to be throwing the Stern Guard around the map with the Wings of Sanguinius. It basically gets to teleport a unit each turn, and the Whirlwind can provide a little bit of ignore line of sight fire support. Overall, quite a nicely balanced list with a couple of really cool Blood Angels units. I feel like the Dreadnought teleporting things around seems quite fun as well. Next up for the Black Templars, I did think that the big points cuts that they got to their core Crusader squads were pretty fun. Looks like this list by Corey Tickall though has gone for a bit more of a combined arms Space Marine approach, a good variety of different units, lots of characters, and a bunch of the unique tank variants. For this one, it looks like most of those characters are joining either the Aggressors, Primaris Sword Brethren, or a 10-man Primaris Crusader squad. Perhaps a little bit hard to tell exactly what goes with what most of the time, but Helbrecht and Grimaldus would have the choice of either the Sword Brethren or Crusaders. There's the Apothecary Biologist who takes Sigismund's seal, and he'd be joining the Aggressors, I guess. There's a Castellan with a power weapon, who I guess will probably be joining whichever squad Helbrecht brings to bring some lethal hits to the table. The Lone Operative Lieutenant with a combi weapon, who could just be an annoying unit to hoover up secondaries, or suppose you could mark the objective for some rerolls for maybe some of the tanks perhaps. And then there's a Primaris Tech Marine to support the Gladiators presumably. Then beyond the main threatening squads, there's a unit of 5 Devastators with Grav Cannon, Thunderhammer and combi weapon. Could just be a unit to camp some home objectives, or I guess you could strategic reserve them if it made sense. A unit of 5 Hellblasters, which I suppose it's either them or the Sword Brethren in the Impulsor I suppose. Both of them seem like they'd work okay there. Again, one unit of 3 Inceptors with the Bolters, close range deep strike, fairly good damage, and handy for enemy backfield type secondary objectives. And then 2 units of 5 Infiltrators to deny enemy deep strike on objectives. There's a Calatus Assassin, again doing Calatus Assassin things, and then a set of the Black Templar unique vehicles, the Impulsor taking the Bellicastus missiles, and then the Gladiator Lancer and the Gladiator Reaper, both of which also get a multi-melter for only a tiny points increase. Overall, maybe a list that's a little bit harder to work out without seeing it played than some. There is a fair bit of choice for characters joining different things and transport options. I'm not really too surprised to see some good use of the tanks with the multi-melters now. They do seem to be pretty much flatly superior to standard Space Marines, with multi-melters either being an extra 5 points or completely free on the Impulsor. Next up, we've got the Deathwatch, which were previously arguably the strongest out of the Space Marines by quite a way, though unlike the rest of them, they had some of their unique units nerfed in the balanced data slate, rather than the various buffs that the other chapters got. Terence Drew still managed to pull out some good results at that RatCon tournament though, going 4 wins to 1 loss, using the Black Spear Task Force of course, and this one mainly builds around 2 big scary Proteus kill teams, and then a bunch of more standard Space Marine support. Leading the list is the Apothecary Biologist who takes the Beacon Angelis. He could be used to teleport some Eradicators around, I suppose. There's a big unit of 6 of them with 2 multi-melters, and that looks like a pretty terrifying anti-tank strike right there. Using Rapid Ingress for 0 CP could be pretty good as well. You could potentially use that to get the Eradicators into melter range. Otherwise, there's a Phobos Lieutenant with the Thief of Secrets, a personal melee buff, which is perhaps a slightly surprising one. I haven't seen very many competitive Deathwatch lists pass up the Tome of Ectoclades for the Double Oath of Moment for a turn. I'm genuinely not too sure if he's running with the Eliminators or the Infiltrators or the Spectres team somehow. For the main damage hammer of the list, there's now the slightly more expensive Proteus kill teams. They definitely still pack an absolutely enormous punch though. 4 Infernus heavy bolters in the unit, 3 Cyclone missile launchers from Terminators, 1 tanky Thunderhammer and Storm Shield Terminator, a biker, and a shield and melee weapons sergeant. Really quite big and general purpose threats there. There's then a unit of infiltrators that can deny deep strikes with their Omni Scramblers, and a different unit fielded as a Spectres kill team, but basically the same models. For their trade-off, they gain scouts and the ability to basically redeploy and jump on and off the board in different terms. They seem like quite a good unit for doing secondaries. There's the big unit of Eradicators, presumably going with the Apothecary Biologist. Another smaller unit with Multi-Melter could potentially be a strategic reserve unit, I suppose. 2 close striking units of Inceptors, one with Bolters, one with Plasma. That unit of Eliminators with all las fusils this time round, no Instigator Bolt Carbine for the double move, and then some still very efficient anti-tank firepower with 2 Gladiator Lancers. They're still remaining very good despite the points increase. Overall, cool to see a different take on Deathwatch. I think I will be quite tempted to try and get the Tome of Ectoclades in there myself though. It definitely seems to have worked pretty well though. 4 wins at a big tournament, and just 1 loss against the World Eaters list that we'll get onto in just a second. Finally, for the Imperium, we've got the Wolves of Fenris, with a successful list run by Orion Crotto, using it to take third at Fields of Damnation, winning 4 games and losing 1 in a big tournament of 54 players. This list gains style points, as unlike the Blood Angels and Dark Angels list, this one actually takes the Champions of Rust detachment, and I guess to try and make the sagas work, the list is absolutely spectacularly character heavy. I guess just upping the chance of you getting these sagas going early, though it's still going to be an absolutely massive deal whether or not the characters can achieve those different objectives in one way or another. For the characters, we've got Beyond the Fell-Handed and Murderfang just as 2 very dangerous dreadnoughts. Beyond the Fell-Handed was fairly auto-include before, and I think is even more so at 180 points. He's been run with a Hellfrost cannon here, heading up 2 big squads of 6 Thunderwolf cavalry, our Herald Deathwolf and a Wolflord on a Thunderwolf with lightning claws that have been given the Frost weapon upgrade, and then a Wolfguard battle leader will join one of those squads to give them some lethal hits, which is quite nice with all those mid-strength damage 2 attacks. He's got a Thunderhammer and Storm Shield and the Black Death weapon upgrade. Otherwise, there's an Iron Priest with a Tempest Hammer, I guess buffing either the Land Raider or the Predator with the las cannons. Ulrich the Slayer, who looks like he'd be running with a big squad of 10 Blood Claws. He is really quite cheap now, and he makes those Blood Claws genuinely quite fearsome against harder targets, rerolling 1s to hit and wound just innately with them. But if they attack against characters, vehicles, or monsters, they get 4 rerolls to hit and wound, and even if you get into be attacking with a whole bunch of chainsword attacks, that's still really quite fearsome. Otherwise, there's a unit of 5 Intercessors packing a Power Fist, a unit of 5 Hounds of Morkai that look like they're backed up by a Lieutenant and Phobos armor. The Hounds also got a solid enough drop, and they've got all their devastating wound things going on, so I think they're a lot more interesting than Reavers. 3 little units of Fenrisian Wolves that look like they will be quite good just to run as screens or maybe in strategic reserve for doing secondary objectives, and then a great big Land Raider Redeemer with those Flamestorm cannons. I guess that'll be transporting the Blood Claws and probably Ulrich into battle, as well as just being a big armoured thing with a lot of Overwatch. I guess that the Iron Priest would be supporting the Predator Annihilator in hindsight with the las cannons, hitting on 2+ and giving it some repairs. Fun to see another Land Raider on the table, and overall just looks like really quite a cool list that's making the best out of the Space Wolves unique detachment. The only loss was in round 2 to the winning Ultramarines list that we talked about at the start of the video. Chaos time next, and first up we've got a Chaos Space Marine list by Manel Tuller, using this one to come forth at a 40-player tournament called Iberian Open, going 4 wins and 1 loss. Again, perhaps this one isn't enormously different to the one that we talked about last week. Still seems to be heavy use of Forge Fiends, Obliterators, and Abaddon the Despoiler once more. Looks like in this one, Abaddon's probably handing out his big rerolls to things like the Obliterators and Forge Fiends potentially. And then there's 2 undivided Chaos Lords with the Demon Hammers leading 2 units of Chosen up the board. They've got the potential for some big damage rerolls with the Undivided stratagem and strike with their usual flavours of Accursed Weapons and Power Fist. Then for some very big firepower, there's 2 units of 4 Obliterators and 2 Forge Fiends with the triple Ectoplasma cannons. For each of those, they're sort of mixed again. One of the units is Nurgle and one of them's Undivided for both the Obliterators and the Forge Fiend, The Undivided one has the powerful damage dealing stratagem. Nurgles may be a little bit more useful just for the standard dart packs that they can make, plus it can be very powerful to keep a squad alive via making them untargetable outside of 12 inches. There's a Chaos Rhino that's Nurgle marked to transport some of the Chosen into battle, it would seem. One unit of 10 cultists, presumably to hold some home field objectives, and then a small amount of allied demons, 2 units of 3 Nurglings, and 1 unit of 3 Flamers. The Nurglings in particular seem like absolutely excellent secondary doing units, both deep strike, infiltrate, and a whole bunch of wounds on the board, plus might even debuff enemy hit rolls every so often if you do get close enough. That's really not too bad for 35 points. The list's only loss seemed to be against Imperial Knights in round 4. For the Scions of Magnus, this Thousand Sons list was run by a Christian Pierce. This one placed third at that big Ratcon tournament. 4 wins to 1 loss, and it seems like the major change that this one's made versus quite a lot of other Thousand Sons lists prior to this is there don't seem to be any Scarab Occult Terminators in it. They've often tended to be used for that enormous damage combo that you can do with Magnus, loads of stacking modifiers plus stripping enemy saves, but not happening in this one it would seem. The list still seems to be made up of lots of units that went up. Basically, Games Workshop nerfed the entire core of the Thousand Sons army. There's Magnus the Red, Ahriman on disc with his free Cannibalistic Ritual once per game, an Exalted Sorcerer on disc, a regular Sorcerer with Lord of Forbidden Law which allows you to double up on a ritual if needed, and then a whole trio of Infernal Masters. These guys, I suppose, bringing the Psychic Shooting might here. One of them takes Arcane Vortex for extra power for his shooting attacks, and one takes the Umbrellific Crystal, so I guess he's going to be teleporting a Rubric squad across the board. Some combination of those are leading 4 different Rubric Marine units. 3 of them take Warp Flamers in each squad, 1 takes a Soul Reaper cannon for some extra firepower, and the Aspiring Sorcerer a Warp Flame pistol. Seems like that's probably one of the more fun damage dealing loadouts to me. Between those rubrics and all the sorcerers, there will be really quite a lot of Kabbalistic ritual points on the board. Big potential for stripping saves from enemies, Doombolt, or the other shenanigans. Besides that, there's a unit of cultists that went down in points very slightly. A Mutalith Vortex Beast still being played despite the points increase, still pretty tough and fairly general purpose damage. A Thousand Sons Rhino that could take a couple of the units of Rubric Marines if needed, and then a little bit of allied demon support with some lone operatives, a changeling and the blue scribes. Always handy to have lone operatives bouncing around, very handy for objectives and things. Overall very cool though, still seems that Thousand Sons can put out the results despite all the points increases. There's generally going to be a unit or 2 less on the board though following Games Workshop's changes. Next up for the World Eaters, they did rather better with points changes from the balanced data slate. This list was won by Dean Simbeck from Blog for the Blood God, a fairly unusual looking World Eaters list with Angron and 2 of the now massively cheaper Lord of Skulls slogging up the board. Pretty interesting to see a list that's got basically 2/3 of the army contained in just 3 models there. I guess the Lord of Skulls do have really quite intimidating stats. They did go down really quite significantly in the balanced data slate, and maybe a few less armies are going to be expecting to be going up against mass armour. Might be more than certain armies can deal with. Otherwise, there's a unit of 10 Jackals that look like they'd be quite good for holding down a home field objective, 3 units of 8 bound, 2 regular ones with Lacerators, and 1 exalted 8 pounds with a dual chain fist. I guess you could maybe scout the regular ones and rapid ingress the exalted if you wanted. And then there's a World Eater's Lord on Juggernaut with Favourite of Khorne. That's the one that allows you a big reroll on the Blood Tithe points, makes it a lot more likely to resurrect Angron if he's slain. Overall, fun to see surprise Khornate Demon Engines doing lots of good work. The only loss was to the winning Drukhari round 4. I'd guess that really big targets like that might not get on very well with a bunch of fast-moving chaff units plus a million Dark Lancers. Finally, for the unique god-specific Chaos Legions, we've got the Death Guard. Definitely an army that got really quite a bunch of interesting buffs, with loads of units going down huge amounts, plus the new Contagions. And one list that did rather well with the new rules is this one by a gentleman called Gispano MDE, winning 4 games out of 5 at the Iberian Open. The list is a very armour-heavy Death Guard list. Mortarion heads it up, now is only 325 points, very tough for the cost, and brings some interesting buffs and still a fair bit of melee. It looks like there's Typhus heading up a unit of 20 Poxwalkers, just feels like an efficient all-round unit with a bunch of bodies for objectives, plus Typhus's mortal wounds spouting out of it each turn, and then a Death Guard Terminator Sorcerer with the Deadly Pathogen upgrade. He's leading up a big unit of 6 Death Shroud Terminators, not really too surprised at all to see them in a list given that they went down quite so much, as well as already being one of Death Guard's best units. There's 2 cheap units of Cultists, I guess for actions and objectives and things, and then a whole bunch of demon engines and armour. No less than 3 feated bloat drones with the flesh mowers. Plenty of relatively fast moving close combat goodness there, a Defiler with a Scourge and a twin las cannon, and a Predator Destructor with auto cannon and las cannons. I definitely quite like the bloat drones for just 100 points, might be a bit more tempted with things like Plague Burst Crawlers or Blight Haulers over the Defiler or the Destructor though. As well as the core Death Guard things though, there's no less than 3 allied Wardog Carnivores with Havoc launchers. I think they seem like at least a fairly reasonable pick for most Chaos armies right now. 140 points for some very fast moving and very dangerous melee stats. They've got quite a lot of objective control as well, which could make them quite good for holding midfield points. Nice to see Death Guard back in action and doing well though. This list only lost looked like it came to the new Tau, being unlucky enough to draw against the list that went on to win the whole event round 1. Demons next, and this list was by Javier Palomo, who used it to take third at Art Hobby's Pre-National. 4 wins and 1 loss in a small grand tournament of 20 players. The Demons definitely had a whole load of points cost changed, most of their good greater demons going up a bit, and really quite a lot of the rest of the codex going down a bit. Overall it seems to have shaken out, as the codex is a solid amount weaker overall though, the lesser played stuff not gaining quite as much strength to replace the value of the good greater demons. This list at least seems to be going around the same sort of tactics as most competitive demon lists have gone for so far. Be'lakor to shield your army from range and potentially do Shadow of the Warp shenanigans, and then some solid greater demon damage dealers, a Bloodthirster with Great Axe and Argath the King of Blades to make him even more dangerous, the Lord of Change with the Everstave, some fairly scary close range shooting there, Shalaxi Hellbane, even though she's all the way up at 450 points now, still an enormous melee threat, and beyond that a whole load of demons that look like they're mainly there to just score objectives and things. There's 2 units of 10 Plague Bearers, nice and durable for holding primary points, a fairly impressive 5 units of 3 Nurglings, which seem like they'd give you a massive leg up in the secondary game, plus do a bit of screening, a deep strike threat for some Flamers, and then some Blue Scribes being an annoying lone operative. The list only loss was to Aeldari that won the event in round 4. Finally for Chaos, we've got the dreaded engines of the Chaos Knights. They got a few buffs and a few nerfs in the Dataslate, things like Stalkers and Huntsmen and Brigands all going up a little bit, but Rampagers and Carnivores going down a touch. This list by Hamish Reeve took first at Lakes of Blood. 4 wins, no losses and 1 draw in a 40-player grand tournament. And interestingly, it's a kind of mixed list, still very much sticking with the 6 Brigands that seem to be a common sight in quite a lot of competitive Chaos Knight lists, despite the increase up to 160 points. To be fair, they're still very efficient gun turrets, with the high volume fire paired with the scary thermal spear, all hitting on 2s and getting extra AP if they target the closest thing. It's fun to see quite so many dedicated close combat Chaos Knights on top of that though. There's the new cheaper Knight Rampager at 680 points with Aura of Terror. That's the one that basically allows you to corrupt objectives and make them yours until the enemy can take them away. And then 4 of those scary carnivores to rush up the midfield and to take the central objectives. They do have melee power that can't be ignored by most units. I guess they could use the Rampager for some nearby buffs, and the Rampager does have a very big threat range in itself with its big advance and charge once per game, being even more flexible with the ability to walk through walls when needed. Then there's a couple of units of allied Nurglings, seem to be in semi-auto-include territory at the moment in just about any Chaos list that can take them. Definitely helpful for a nice leg up in the secondary game. For the Xenos, first up we have the dreaded Aeldari. Overall it definitely looks like Games Workshop's balance changes have had really quite a big effect. They have won some events and placed higher really quite a lot more, but it does seem that they're a long way from being anywhere near as oppressive as they were, and a lot more armies have some decent chance to beat them now, with a good list played well. At first glance, I would say that the initial impression that they probably are going to be one of the armies that's strongest in the game does still stand. There seems to be more Aeldari towards the top of the list compared with just about any of the other factions, but definitely far less problematic than they were. One of the good lists that did well this last weekend was this list by Hayden Korak, using it to take second at the Lakes of Blood, 4 wins, 0 losses and 1 draw. There definitely seems to be a fair few Aeldari staples from previously, though it does seem to be quite a lot more infantry heavy than some lists before. I guess at least a fair few of their infantry units weren't hit too hard, and you can still use Phantasm on them. In the army we've got Azaman leading up a unit of Dire Avengers. I'd guess that they're probably the ones that are going to be riding in the Wave Serpents. Quite a lot of general purpose firepower and big Overwatch threat there. And it also seems that we have Fugan around as well with his great big deadly melter weapon. Seems that interestingly enough though, he has not actually got any fire dragons to lead into battle. I'm not entirely sure how he was being used. Maybe in the Wave Serpent as well to be just a massive melter threat with some automatic wounds. I suppose the Eldar have really quite a lot of tricks for keeping units safe between Phantasm and others. There's the staple Autarch Wayleaper with the farming command points and jumping around doing lone operative things. Illic Nightspear, who I think will be running with that big 10-man unit of rangers, making them untargetable at range and giving them some big rerolls. Definitely very scary and a massive threat to characters. Otherwise, there's a Harlequin Solitaire for some very fast-moving combat, even if he is quite fragile. 2 units of 5 Warp Spiders with their big movement, and Shadow Spectres with their jump shoot jump. They could take the fight to enemy infantry, and pretty handy for jumping around doing secondary objectives. And there's another unit of 5 Rangers, maybe could be a choice to either camp a midfield or home field point. Then to bring the standard anti-tank with the big detachment rerolls of 1 hit and 1 wound, there's 3 units of 1 War Walker, each with bright lances, and a Viper with 1 of the same who can strip cover from the enemy army. The Wave Serpent takes a twin bright lancer as well. And there's the trusty and dependable Night Spinner for a little bit of fire support from the backfield. He can punch through some devastating wounds with Fate Dice if needed. I guess one of the interesting things about this list is no Farseers and no Incarn. Seems like Games Workshop's nerfs have perhaps pushed them out of being auto-include territory. Overall pretty interesting to see how the Aeldari are adapting though. Next up, and managing to take down the biggest event of the weekend with a Drukhari. This list was run by Reese Cunningham, and it took first at RatCon. 5 wins and no losses, and I guess beating out the Grey Knights on the same thing on tiebreakers. It seems that the Drukhari really haven't been shying away from still being indexed Dark Lance to some extent. There's 3 units of 5 Scourges here, so 12 Dark Lances there, and despite the points increase there's still 3 Ravagers, so a serious amount of tank busting firepower all in all. The Scourges can jump, shoot, jump, and it still seems that the Ravagers are good enough to make the cut, even though it was mainly a bit painful to have an underwhelming army have its best unit nerfed by quite so much. Otherwise, for a bit more fire support and taking midfield objectives and things, there's 3 units of 10 Kabbalite Warriors mounted in 3 Raiders with Dark Lances. I guess the Archon could go with one of those ones, and they can back a fair punch for their cost with a fair few special weapons. Otherwise, perhaps the other notable thing about this list is that there's a lot of pain engines here. 3 Kronos, which I think is fair enough seeing as they're very tough and only 50 points each, just seem good to have as annoyance units for sitting around on objectives and screening things. Anything else they do is kind of a bonus at that sort of cheap cost. And then 2 units of 2 Talos. They take the Talos Gauntlet, Liquefier Gun, and the Haywire Blaster. Perhaps reasonable enough targets for pain tokens having quite a lot of threat. Finally, and likely doing secondary objectives are 2 units of Mandrakes. They can infiltrate and they can fade on and off the board. Both things that are really quite good for running around and doing point things while the rest of the army gets stuck into the enemy. I think it's very cool to see Drukhari take down a major tournament like this. They were one of the armies that people were generally considering would be kind of weak coming out of the balanced data slate. And while I still think that despite this result they are probably on the lower end of the 40k power spectrum still, I suspect that this list was probably just played very well. It definitely seems that they do at least have the opportunity to compete with the top dogs in the right circumstances. Next up, and for the Deathless Necrons, we've got this list by Devin Orchard. This one was used to take first at W4 GT in Wisconsin. 5 wins and no losses at a 25-player small GT. That seems to be at least fairly standard for Necrons these days. This one still seems to be building very heavily around 2 big blocks of Lichguard with the swords and shields. They add in Technomancers with the Canoptek cloaks, some Cryptothralls for extra durability and making the unit just bigger and giving them more things to reanimate. And then Necron Lords with Resurrection Orbs seem to have supplanted the Overlords. At least now the free stratagems aren't quite as big a deal. One of the Lords takes the Hypermaterial Ablator to give the unit a little bit of extra protection. These Necrons really seem to like their Hex Marks, taking a massive 3 of them. That could give you some pretty godly return fire shenanigans if the opponent finds themselves having to approach the Lich Guard with some more fragile units. And one of the Hex Marks takes the Sovereign Coronal. Seems like he'd be well placed to support the Locust Heavy Destroyers, making them all +1 to hit, and they've got some massive threats with the great big Gauss weapons with damage 6. 3 big units of 3 of them is going to leave a mark on enemy armour. Otherwise, there's a Canoptek Reanimator to support the Lich Guard for some better regeneration, a unit of Tomb Blades that could move up the board early, and some Ophidian Destroyers which can tunnel on and off the board doing secondary objectives, and perhaps one of the most fun looking things on the list is a great big unit of 10 Death Marks. They're really not all that expensive and have some fairly threatening guns with their damage 2 and AP2 shots, plus having Deep Strike means they could have a good chance to just turn up on the board and snipe down an enemy character. Could be some pretty enormous value if they do manage to just eliminate something key. Seems they weren't tempted enough to build around warriors though, given the points changes. It still seems that a lot of people are very happy to stick with Lichguard with their immense -1 to wound and invulnerable saves and some fairly good melee. Next up, we've got another look at a new incarnation of the new Tyranids. In last week's video, we got a look at an Assimilation Swarm. This time there's an Synaptic Nexus that's doing quite well. This one placing in second at the Showdown at Frogtown Grand Tournament, run by a Manic Gudimani, going 4 wins and 1 loss, the only loss against the winning Tau Empire player in round 5. The Synaptic Nexus is the one that gives you 3 waves of buffs, either bonuses to advances and charges, +1 to hit in melee or invulnerable saves, plus really quite a cool stratagem that allows you some big rerolls, perhaps seeming like it could be particularly nice for a bunch of Zoanthropes just trying to annihilate one target with their psychic shooting. The list is headed up by the new and slightly more expensive Hive Tyrant with Heavy Venom Cannon and Bone Sword. He takes Synaptic Control for an extra 20 points, which gives him -1 damage. Probably not the worst idea on a very big and perhaps not all that durable bug. Old One Eye's in there for some melee carnage and his 5+ Feel No Pain. There's 3 units of 3 Zoanthropes for some general purpose damage output, and as mentioned I think they will be quite nice for that irresistible will stratagem with a reroll 1s to hit and wound on one target within 24 inches. There's 2 units of Gargoyles with fast moving objective control and move shoot move, a trusty Biovore to throw out some Spore Mines to hoover up some secondary points, and a single unit of Rippers that can deep strike to do the same. 2 disruptive Neurolictors as very unexpectedly tough lone operatives that can occasionally make a battle-shocked enemy unit +1 to wound if it helps, and then some solid monsters moving up the board, 2 Maleceptors with their powerful close-range shooting, and of course being Synapse creatures in this detachment seems to be no bad thing at all. 2 Exocrines for some higher AP damage 3, and then it looks like the Norn Emissary is having a tournament outing as well. A generally scary profile and a very tough monster to try and kill off the mid-board, particularly if it gets an objective in its sights and triggers its Feel No Pain. It's pretty cool to see another flavour of new Tyranids doing well. I did feel like the Synaptic Nexus was perhaps one of the more interesting detachments as well. It just seems like one of the ones that does do quite a lot for the majority of the swarm and not just some unit subtypes. The Genestealer Cult's got some fairly heavy nerfs from the balanced data slate, things don't respawn as well, and a lot of points went up. It still seems they're breaking into the upper ends of tournaments though, and here's one example of one of those by someone called Chanzeal or Tom, who used it to take 4th at No Surrender, going 4 wins to 1 loss. This list has really quite a lot of bits going on. Looks like the main damage output is coming from Neophytes, Acolytes and Aberrants. The Aberrants are a big unit of 10 of them that can start forward with the Biophagus. I think Inscrutable Cunning Warlord traits can give you a pretty massive alpha strike. There's 3 units of Neophytes, 2 of 20 and 1 of 10. They take maximal seismic cannons and grenade launchers plus the cult icon, and they can still be used to really focus down a couple of enemy units with use of stratagems. Looks like there's 2 Primuses that could possibly drop in those 2 big Neophyte units, giving them some much needed rerolls. There's also some Acolytes as well with a bunch of demo charges, could also be a place where you could put the Primus I suppose. Those guys look like they'd want to be dropping kind of close with the stratagem to pop up just next to the enemy and throw the demo charges all over them, and back that up with a few hand flamers as well. Then, and following the Pure Strain points drop, it seems like that's enough to have a Patriarch leading a unit of Pure Strains into battle. For 20 wounds worth of Genestealers plus the Patriarch, and some fairly good quality combat that doesn't seem to be too bad. It's around about 250 points in all now. And otherwise going through the other bits of the list, there's an Acolyte Icon Ward that I guess would drop with some of the Neophytes, and potentially allow you to save a blip marker once per game. There's 2 lone operatives in a Sanctus with a Biodagger and Kelemorph with the Prowling Adjutant to keep him even more safe. Just some annoying units there to run around the board and not get killed. There's 2 units of Outrider Scouting Jackals with the Mining Laser on the Wolf Quad. And then there's an allied Basilisk from the Imperial Guard Brood Brothers. A little bit of indirect fire certainly doesn't hurt, and it's also got the rather helpful ability to slow a unit down that could be quite handy against the right targets. I feel like playing Genestealer Cult is going to require being a bit more intelligent now, rather than just overwhelming certain armies by throwing endless waves of Neophytes and Acolytes at them. Looks like that the only loss that this one took was to the new and improved Death Guard on round 3. Next up, there was a win for the Tau Empire this last weekend. Thomas Ogden took first at the Showdown at Frogtown, 5 wins and no losses in a small 26-player tournament, and looks like he beat the Tyranids that we mentioned a second ago. This one feels like a very different flavour Tau list from the one that we had last week. That one had lots of small cheap interference units to run around and do objective things. This one really just seems to be a massive hammer of damage aiming to table the opponent. It's mainly building around 2 enormous units of Crisis Battlesuits with maximum cyclic ion blasters, plus some shield generators and shield drones to make them as tough as possible. Looks like one of those units will be dropping with Farsight. If you can get them within the 9 inches to get the +1 to wound with them, then that's going to be enormous. I guess they could be a choice for rapid ingress with that, or just maybe have him as a bit of a nice to have in the unit and be a bit of a charge threat deterrent, and huge extra damage if the opponent does get too close. Otherwise, there's a Cold Star Commander for one of the crisis blocks moving incredibly quickly. He takes 3 Cyclic Ion Blasters, a Shield Generator, and that Exemplar of Cao Yon Warlord trait, the one that allows you to get the enormous damage boost from turn 2, and he gets both a marker and a shield drone. Then beyond that, there's Commander Shadow Sun that dropped down at frankly surprising amounts, down to 100 points. She can farm CP, provide some rerolls nearby, and provide some useful anti-tank firepower herself, loads to like there on a lone operative. And then rather than having too many units to run around and score objectives, almost all the rest of the list is dedicated to more long-range fire support, 2 broadsides with heavy rail rifles, plasma rifles, and weapon support systems, and then 3 Skyray gunships, which I did think were particular winners out of the points cuts, and probably a little bit better than the Hammerheads all in all. They can provide some long-range Seeker Rack fire support with a whole bunch of high-strength shots, and interestingly enough, there's an enormous Beta Strike as well, with 2 Sunstrike bombers as well, jumping in and adding yet more generalist Cyclic Ion style firepower to the fight. Definitely looks like a terrifying Tau list to play. Those Crisis Battlesuit blocks can kill most things in the game, and they're supported by a whole bunch of other fire support that you're going to struggle to ignore as well. Finally, there's a unit of 2 Tetras to give 1 unit 4 rerolls to hit. Again, utterly terrifying if they're supporting those Crisis suits. Overall looks fun. The Tower definitely come up a whole load in the world since the Dataslate. Wouldn't be too surprised to see a whole load more tournament wins from here. Games Workshop's big points cuts do seem to have turned around the leagues of Votann as well, going from generally considered to be one of 40k's very weakest factions to actually being able to win a tournament now, it would seem. This list by someone who seems to have recorded himself as XL took a tournament called the Banished Cup with 4 wins and 1 draw. Leagues of Votann just get an enormous amount more stuff compared with what they did, given all the big points cuts to them. And it seems that this list seems to have put those points all into Hernkin Pioneers, Brockir Thunderkin, and Ironhair Hearthguard, and a bunch of Sagittars as well. Going through it bit by bit, first up there's a car with a long list. That's the one that allows you to redistribute judgment tokens if his unit kills one. I guess he'd probably be going with the Ironhair Hearthguard, though I'm not sure if the Ironhair Champion might take that honour. Just in general, the list does seem like a bit of an interesting one. There's a lot of character spam and actually a lot more characters than there are units for them to join. It looks like a bunch of the characters are actually just starting in the Sagittars as little mini units. One Sagittar looks like it has the Chthonian Berserks inside it, and then it looks like another one just might literally have a Grimnir in each with their little mini units plus their psychic shooting attack. Kind of interesting little units there if that's the case. And seems that the list really didn't want to run any Hearthkin warriors. Otherwise, for some of the main damage dealers of the list, there's 3 Brockir Ironmasters, each one heading up a unit of Brockir Thunderkin with the Graviton Blast Cannons. Really quite general purpose guns, those ones. And I feel like now those units are just 75 points each. They're genuinely very good units, both in terms of damage and defense. Maybe still some slight issues with being a little bit slow and short range though. Definitely seems like a great overall offering between them and the character for each one of them though, for just north of 200 points. There's then the big unit of Ironhair Hearthguard with Vulcanite Disintegrators for some devastating wounds, Concussion Gauntlets, and the Concussion Hammer. They get a Teleport Crest, I'd guess going with the Carl, but could be the champion. The unit of Berserks takes the Concussion Mauls plus a Maul Grenade, and then there's a whole bunch of Hernkin Pioneer Bikers, all of which taking the High-Las Rotary Cannons. I guess there should be some fairly fast-moving Alpha Strikes early in the game between them and all of those Sagittars. Looks like the Sagittar war gear isn't actually recorded. I guess it's probably the High-Las Beam Cannons as they're listed as the default gear on the datasheet. They are quite nice anti-tank as well. Overall, definitely a bit of a different and unexpected Leagues of Votann list. I feel like it's kind of rare to see a list that doesn't have 1 or 2 of the Hecaton Land Fortresses in, particularly as they're down to really quite cheap points cost now. Seems like the Space Dwarves do seem to be back in style in 10th edition though. A lot more threat on the table, plus they'll be wounding a bunch of enemies a bit easier with all the judgment tokens they get to hand out at the start of the game. Finally we come to the Greenskins. They weren't doing too terribly before the Dataslate and did get quite a lot of points cuts, even if there's a fair few units in their index that still seem to be really quite overcosted, particularly some of the Buggies and the Planes. This list by Thomas Cruikshank was used to take 6th at Field of Damnation, winning 4 games out of 5. The only loss was against some Necrons in round 2. This one's really quite fun in that it's basically a full Truck Boys army. 6 trucks with the Wrecking Balls, despite going up to 60 points, they're still great. In those trucks, there's 1 unit of Beast Snagger Boys led up by a Beast Boss, 4 units of regular boys with Power Claw, Rockets, and Choppers. I guess one of them might have the Weird Boy attached as well for jumping around the board. And then perhaps the most fearsome threat out of any of them is Captain Badrug, who's leading a full 10-strong squad of Flashgits, some pretty fearsome firepower there. Then for other fairly scary things piling forward as well, there's a beast boss on a Squigosaur who takes Ed Whopper's Kill Chopper for extra fight, a bunch of 6 Squighog boys with a Knob on Smasher Squig to lead them. They'll be at least fairly good into monsters and vehicles with their Beast Snagger buffs, and then a fair few units for objectives and interference, 3 units of 5 Storm Boys, 1 unit of 10 Gretchen, which could farm some CP, and a small unit of War Bikers with a Power Claw as well. Looks pretty fun, an absolute ton of very fast moving green-skinned violence. Looks like a list that might want to zoom up the board and get everything in position turn 1 before calling the war turn 2 and just drowning the enemy in loads of melee. I feel like there's probably a fair few different ways that you could go with the contents of the trucks. Knobs and Mega Knobs certainly gained quite a bit given all their points cuts, though they wouldn't have quite as much objective control, I guess. In any case, with the Xenos armies talked through, I guess that brings us to the end of the video. Hope you've enjoyed a quick look through one strong army list for each and every army in Warhammer 40k. And as I said before, I think it is really quite encouraging that we're seeing quite so many good results with quite so many armies literally a week and a half after Games Workshop's points update. Does show that things are going in the right direction. Feel free to let me know any insights about the lists. Obviously, as I wasn't the person who either wrote or played them, I'm sure I'm missing all sorts of subtleties, so any insights are greatly appreciated, and I'll try and update the video with a pinned comment down below if there are any major errors. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that link in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.